Technologies for their support of Kansas GFOA and their willingness to sponsor the virtual conference. Without their support, we would not have been able to deliver the annual conference this year. Please go to the conference website and check out the company profile and resource board of information. Brendan Travis, Director of Business Development with Tyler Cybersecurity, is this morning's speaker. He brings over 20 years of security, risk, and compliance experience to the Tyler team, with an established ability to develop long-term collaborative partnerships by linking functional advantages across disciplines in support of strategic business objectives. He's a certified information security manager and has an MBA from Clarkson University. Welcome, Brendan, and thank you for being here to share with us your expertise on achieving cybersecurity resilience using a lifecycle approach.
My pleasure. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Paula. It's great to be here. Thank you all for joining us here this morning. As Matt mentioned, my name is Brendan Travis. I am a director with Tyler Cybersecurity. I have been working in security, risk, and compliance for the past 20 years. In today's topic, achieving cybersecurity resilience using a lifecycle approach, quite honestly, I'm so happy we're finally at a point in this particular domain, in this industry of cybersecurity, where we are talking about resilience, also known as the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties, or also known as toughness or grit. Quite honestly, the conversation around security for quite a long period of time, and it still is pervasive, is avoid, encountering these security events, prevent them from happening altogether. And without a doubt, there is a place for those controls and those technologies to be implemented. But, at the same time, I think we've learned over the course of, the last, 20, 25 years, that, there is no silver bullet and there's no guarantee that we're going to be able to do that. Prevention and avoidance is a principled approach, and I certainly value that sort of mindset. But at the same time, I think we need to be a little bit more open to exploring other avenues relative to driving toward this concept of resilience. So that's what we're going to talk about here this morning. And before I launch into the presentation, if I can advance my slide deck here, a few quick housekeeping items. So the duration of this webinar will be about 45 minutes or so. We will have a Q&A period after the fact. I understand you can use your chat function within Zoom to pose questions. We'll collect those and we'll cycle through them at the end of the presentation. If for some reason we don't get the chance to address a particular question, we'll follow up after the fact and get those answers into your hands. At the conclusion of the webinar, importantly, our goal and objective here is really to bring meaningful and relevant information to you all. That is kind of the name of the game here. We want to make sure we are on target. We're, delivering, I guess, insight that is valuable and worthwhile, and is really giving you, making your time productive here this morning. So we certainly encourage you to fill out those surveys. That will help us improve our efforts going forward, and certainly appreciate that on your part. So in terms of Tyler Cybersecurity in particular, we were formerly known as Sage Data Security, and we were an exclusive cybersecurity firm. We didn't, and we still don't, we didn't sell hardware or software. We weren't network administrators. We didn't provide network administration, architecture, design, implementation. We were focused on keeping sensitive information secure and protected, and which it still holds true. However, we are now part of Tyler Technologies, our parent company. We are a business unit within Tyler Technologies. We were acquired back in 2018, so about 2.5 years ago. And prior to that, we were actually working with Tyler. They were a client of Sage, and they saw value in the services we brought to the table. Just in terms of I guess the need out there, right? There's quite a bit of a gap or a deficiency in supply relative to domain expertise, because, again, we are not technologists, we are security practitioners, and there is a distinction there. It's important to maintain those segregation of duties between, again, the folks that are charged with and tasked with maintaining and administering network environments versus the folks that are tasked with, securing those environments. Hopefully there's some oversight and some independence between those two functional tasks. So what we have in store for you this morning, we're going to throw quite a bit of information at you, and there's going to be a lot to consume and digest. So I just want to kind of set that tone right from the beginning here. But we got the introductions out of the way. First and foremost, we're going to start off in talking about what is cybersecurity maturity, setting the stage for this conversation. Again, I know we're talking about achieving cybersecurity resilience using a life cycle model, but the concept of cybersecurity maturity and cybersecurity resilience are closely interrelated, right? So as you advance the maturity of your cybersecurity program, your capacity for resilience also increases. So we'll take a quick look at what we mean by cybersecurity maturity. And from there, we're going to transition just into some myth busting. So there are some common misperceptions around cybersecurity in particular. We're going to talk about what those misconceptions are, and we're going to, talk about the reality involved, because, I think traditionally there is, or has been anyway, a negative connotation associated with security in general, right? It's typically something that is forced upon you, either by a compliance mandate, or maybe after the fact, a third-party provider, or something that is charged with to an organization where maybe they're not proactively bringing that on and making that decision to do it themselves. So, it's typically something that's been forced upon them. So we'll talk about those misconceptions, and we'll talk about the reality involved. From there, we're going to transition to a history lesson. There has been a paradigm shift in this particular industry, again, over the last 20 years or so, where what was once known as information security has now evolved and transitioned into cybersecurity. So there is a distinction between those two terms. We'll kind of lay out the particulars around what were the contributing factors that led to that evolution. And from there, we're going to transition into, okay, how do we go about developing a cybersecurity culture? Because quite honestly, if we're going to achieve resiliency in our cybersecurity program, there has to be a cultural shift within any organization. There has to be a recognition and an acceptance across the board, really, that this is important. We have a responsibility, a civic responsibility, quite honestly, but not only a civic responsibility, a responsibility for our constituents, the clients we serve, the customers we serve. That again, we are custodians of sensitive information, and we have a responsibility on our shoulders to make sure that that information is not disclosed or put at risk as a result of our efforts as, again, custodians of that sensitive information. So we'll talk about that culture. From there, we'll just talk about the cybersecurity lifecycle, because again, it is an ongoing lifecycle approach to how you go about not necessarily combating cybersecurity, but really rising up to the challenge of cybersecurity, because it is such a dynamic and evolving sort of industry and market anyway, that it really requires a regular approach, a consistent, regular approach to making sure you're doing what you need to do to be on top of the latest trends in the external threat environment, any regulatory or legislative changes that are coming down the pike, what your partners or vendors are expecting of you, and in particular, what your business goals and objectives are, right? Where is your agency or organization headed in the next 6, 12, 18 months and thereafter? So that's the agenda today. From there, once we kind of wrap that up, again, we'll walk into a Q&A, and let's kind of get started here. So what is cybersecurity maturity? So there are three particular disciplines. So if you look on the left-hand vertical sort of axis here, people, process, technology, right? Those are the three pillars of cybersecurity maturity. All three areas require investment and development, and certainly attention in the context of cybersecurity, I guess, requirements, right? And what is expected of any organization or agency. So, as we kind of move from people, process, and technology from a foundational level, tier 1, again, on the left-hand side of your screen, what are some of the attributes and characteristics of a foundational tier 1 level organization relative to cybersecurity maturity? From the people perspective, you have limited staff and minimal awareness around cybersecurity. Process related, again, no formal security program is in place. And from a technology perspective, very few controls in place, limited oversight, right? So that's sort of, again, the characteristics of a very immature program. And then you work your way up all the way to a tier 5, or what we call a sustainable program, where, again, from a people perspective, cybersecurity culture is supported for continuous improvement. From a process perspective, you have a full program. It's documented, tracked, updated regularly for continuous improvement. And from a technology perspective, you have comprehensive controls in place. They're reviewed on a regular basis. And again, you'll see that term rear its head again, continuous improvement. And again, that just goes back to that life cycle approach where, you're never done. There's no end game when it comes to cybersecurity, because everything is constantly in flux. It's a very fluid and dynamic environment. And obviously, everything in between as far as tier 2, 3, and 4. And I just want to make mention that, the objective might not necessarily be to achieve a tier 5 status for each and every organization. You might very well, just look to either achieve a tier 3 or a tier 4, depending upon business operations. What is your business model? What information are you collecting? What sort of constituencies do you serve? What is the risk profile, right, that is associated with your organization? That's then going to drive sort of the tier, designation or objective you're looking to achieve. So. With that, I guess, established, right, we've kind of talked about defining what cybersecurity maturity is. Let's go through some myth busting. So myth number 1, cybersecurity is a goal to be achieved. Again, we just mentioned it. There is no destination here. It's not as if you make an investment and you can kind of clean your hands, wipe your hands of, I guess, the need here and say, we're done here. Again, it is an ongoing and evolving process, and you think about just from internally your business strategy, right? What new technologies are you adopting in the coming year, or in the recent past? What information is being collected? How is it being stored, processed, and transmitted? Who needs access to that information? When do they need access to the information? How do they need access to the information? Adding or changing services to your business model, entering into new vendor relationships or partnerships, bringing in new employees. You're certainly, adding new roles, and people are coming and going on, maybe not a regular basis, but probably periodically. So, all of those considerations change the risk dynamic with your organization as it relates to cybersecurity. So, again, not only the internal disruptions, but also the external threat environment. I mean, these bad actors are constantly upping their game. You just look at, the current state of affairs where we are now, and this is a timely and relevant topic. October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We are on the cusp of an election, right? It's an election year. A few weeks, there's going to be an election. We already know there's all manner of foreign interference happening on a regular basis, and that is just increased. That's ratcheted up. Again, in any election year. So we have that to contend with. Our nation is really going through a period of pretty high social unrest, right? Coast to coast, there seems to be a high level of anxiety, and certainly you have perpetrators looking to take advantage of the disconnect really as a society. So you have all those conditions. Then we are all experiencing an economic downturn. There's no industry that hasn't been touched by really the underpinning here. This is global health crisis we're all dealing with, which is why we're meeting here virtually. Where in a normal year or normal times anyway, we'd doing this in person and be able to kind of network with each other and we'd be seeing each other face to face. Obviously, that's simply not the case this year. So, the reality is that you can't eliminate all risk, right? You can mitigate risk. You can actually take the risk and try to put controls to mitigate the likelihood that risk will be recognized. You can transfer risk through a third party, a liability policy, or a business partner. You can choose to accept that risk, right? There might be very well risk that's identified that's a low level risk, and you might very well choose to accept that risk. There is actually a fourth option, and that's avoidance, risk avoidance altogether. I didn't put it on here. I mean, if you're looking to avoid the risk altogether, that simply means that you're not, looking to conduct the business that you would have otherwise chosen to do. So I guess you're looking for a new line of business at that point. But, that's just the reality here is that risk is inherent, and it's a matter of making sure you identify what that risk is and then what to do with it. Second myth, cybersecurity is the responsibility of IT. This is pervasive, and we'll talk. This will be just in terms of why that's the case. I mean, I think people tend to associate cybersecurity with technology and thinking of it purely as a technology challenge or problem. And I don't want to minimize the importance that technology plays, because it's significant, without a doubt. However, if you're looking at it solely through that technology lens, there's going to be gaps. And again, that's what we're going to be talking about primarily in terms of achieving resiliency, is broadening the definition outside of just looking at your IT landscape. Again, we talked about those three pillars of cybersecurity elements, right? It's critical elements of cybersecurity: people, process, technology. We typically look at the challenge in that order: people, process, and then technology. Again, the lion's share of investment has typically gone to technology when you talk about firewalls and antivirus and multi-factor authentication and all, password protocols and things of that nature. And again, there is absolutely a place for those technologies and those needs. I don't want to suggest there is not. However, let's not just limit it to those particular considerations, right? Because people are the weakest link. Picnics are plentiful. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that acronym there. Problem in chair, not in computer, right? The problem oftentimes is a lack of awareness and a situational understanding where the person behind the computer at the keyboard is either absent-minded. Typically it's not a malicious sort of scenario, but accidents happen and mistakes happen, and it's typically we have so many things going on in our day-to-day lives, and that challenge again is ratcheted up with the whole work from home environments that many of us are operating in now. It's again typically a matter of time when some security event or incident is exposed, and it's typically a result of some social engineering effort, some phishing email, or some account takeover, something that involves the human aspect of our control environment. And importantly, communication needs to come from the top. Cybersecurity is cross-functional; it's multidisciplinary. But when you talk about ensuring that there's an understanding and awareness, that really has to come from leadership at the executive level. They're the ones to set the tone. It's very difficult to move from a bottom up sort of process to make headway and make gains when it comes to changing the mindset. And again, this goes back to the culture conversation that we talked about earlier. So that is myth number two. It is not simply an IT responsibility. The third myth that is out there is data breaches only happen to large organizations, right? So more often than not, we know malicious actors are opportunistic. When you think about what is happening in the external threat environment, oftentimes there are perpetrators out there who are just running network scans on a regular basis, looking at IP addresses that they're running through a scanner and looking for vulnerabilities, looking for areas of opportunity. And, those IP ranges oftentimes don't have a flashing neon sign, letting the perpetrator know who that particular entity is, who that organization is. Oftentimes they are just looking for the low-hanging fruit, right? So if there is a vulnerability that's identified, let's exploit that vulnerability. And once we're successful there, it's a matter of, okay, well, who's behind this wall? What's at my disposal now? Who did I get into, and what information do I have available to me? I don't want to suggest that targeted attacks don't happen, because we know they do. People have, an axe to grind around, a particular social consideration, or, maybe a large organization they have an issue with, then absolutely they might target those organizations for particular attacks. But when it's financially motivated, oftentimes, again, those perpetrators are just looking for opportunity. And again, it is a numbers game, path of least resistance. So why would you spend the majority of your time and effort trying to break down the door of, Fort Knox, let's say, when you can just push the door open with another, less secure network environment, and all of a sudden, okay, you have a path of opportunity there. So, and importantly, we only hear the tip of the iceberg relative to the number of incidents out there. I mean, an organization, if they don't have to disclose, or they don't have to, make folks aware that they had a security incident, there's really little upside of promoting that. Again, unless that there's folks that have been impacted by it adversely. However, you think about just the number of stories that's in the news on a daily basis relative to security breaches and compromises. I mean, it's almost every other day you're hearing about one, and that's, again, just the ones that do get reported. So that's another myth. The fourth one, again, is back to this pervasive sort of perception out there that cybersecurity is simply looked at primarily as a liability policy. Well, I'm purchasing this. It's kind of a cost center. It's a one-way outbound spend. What am I getting in return for that investment in cybersecurity? The reality is, if it's done efficiently and effectively, there are concrete and tangible benefits that come from a well-conceived program. First and foremost, institutional memory, right? This is the concept that, a lot of the business tasks and techniques by how we carry out our daily activities are oftentimes up in the heads of a few key individuals, right? Stakeholders that have typically been at the organization for a number of years. They're the ones that know how to get things done. And really, that is intelligence. That is, the important information that is really should be the ownership of the institution, right? So how do we document that information? How does it get codified such that, again, if that person leaves, or you have individuals that win the lottery and they don't walk through that door the next day. Well, someone's got to step into those shoes. How do I go about doing X, Y, and Z? Well, there's a learning curve there, obviously. And how do you flatten that curve such that whoever, again, steps into those shoes can do it and be more productive in a shorter period of time, right? That comes from making sure you have access to information that's really valuable, but oftentimes doesn't get, documented in a way that's easily accessible for the organization. Business continuity. Again, this is the concept that if you do go through a security incident, an event of some sort, you can maintain servicing your constituents, providing the services you would otherwise, even in the face of adversity, while you're dealing with whatever it is you're dealing with, some security event or occurrence. again, you are still able to function as you would otherwise, simply because you have processes in place, you have people who know their roles and responsibilities, you have an awareness and an understanding that, okay, that event, whatever it might happen to have been, was detected early on, it's been isolated, it's been contained, right? So it's not, the impact of that particular event is minimized, and you're able to continue operating as you would otherwise. Information assurance, right? So you have, hopefully the information at your disposal within your organization is accurate, right? The integrity is still there. You think about critical information that is maybe accessible to anyone in the organization. Anyone can modify, a spreadsheet or, some critical data set that the organization is making decisions on. Well, that's a risk there, right? Because you want to make sure that business decisions are being made based on accurate information, right? So that's another outcome, again, of a well-conceived program. And the last one being employee empowerment, right? So oftentimes, again, people perceive security as being obstructive. It's an obstacle for me to get through my day-to-day tasks and responsibility. So, if employees aren't made aware or educated why these things are in place and what the implications are for any particular security protocol, oftentimes they'll look for a workaround. How can I bypass this, new constraint on my day-to-day? Because I perceive it as, again, just something that, I don't see the value, I guess, is really what it comes down to. So empower those employees, educate them, give them an awareness, and they're much more likely to buy in, really, and follow suit. Right, so we've kind of bust some myths. Let's transition quickly to a history lesson here, because there has been a paradigm shift, like I said, between information security versus cybersecurity. So flashback about 20 years ago, the financial institution, the Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, FFIEC, right? They were the agency that was required or tasked with, making sure organizations being financial institutions, were compliant with new legislation that went into effect in 1999. This was the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, but was also known as the Financial Services Modernization Act. Essentially, what it said is, my goodness, we're doing so many of our financial transactions in a digitized fashion these days. We really need to make sure we maintain integrity behind our financial institutions. There is risk involved. We need to get our hands, around that risk. And in order to do that, we need to impose rules on our financial institutions, because if we don't, it's part of our nation's critical infrastructure. If there's any question around the integrity of that infrastructure, that's going to cause problems, right? And how do we minimize that risk? Well, it comes through a number of rules that were put out there. Financial institutions had to have a written information security plan. They had to conduct regular, comprehensive risk analyses against handling non-public information. They had to develop, monitor, and test these program attributes. And importantly, and to its credit, it did allow for updates to be made with how information is either stored, processed, transmitted, et cetera. So it was a good start. And how it played out was essentially financial institutions said, okay, we have all these new requirements imposed on us. We need an information security officer. That role had to be established. Where do you think those responsibilities went to? Went to IT, right? They figured, well, this is all about technology. So, the IT director, network administrator, whoever was best equipped, or maybe not best equipped, but someone had to have that new designation of an information security officer. So that's typically where those responsibilities were directed. And essentially the process that was laid out there is financial institutions, they conducted an asset inventory. Let's look at all the assets that are in our production environment. From there, let's identify our quote unquote critical assets, right? And how did they define that? Essentially, that was where the assets that either stored, processed, or transmitted GLBA data. right? So account information, name, date of birth, social security number, all the sensitive information that would need to be protected. Those needed to be protected based on our quote unquote critical assets. So ensure those assets had an adequate control environment, right? Regular backups, they're tested periodically for vulnerabilities. They're secured through any number, they're encrypted. There's a number of different controls that need to be imposed on those critical assets. And then you had this wash, rinse, repeat cycle where there was a regular assessment. The problem is that that sort of approach was neither comprehensive nor holistic, right? Why are we just looking at our critical assets? What about the non-critical assets, right? They're still operating on a production environment. They still might very well have vulnerabilities associated with them. Should they be exploited and compromised, that simply provides a foot in the door for a perpetrator to maneuver horizontally within a network environment, right? So once they've gained access within any network environment, it's a matter of, okay, well, how can I pivot from here? Where can I go, right? And again, this question, who was responsible? Like I mentioned earlier, again, IT was responsible for quite understandable reasons. It's just a matter of, broadening out, sort of the responsibility of, security didn't have its own carve out at the time. There was no, typically no security function outside of IT. Again, this was a while back. So what happened in the intervening years? I mean, if you recall back in, I'm dating myself now, but 99, 2000, Y2K was out there. There was a Melissa virus, an I love you virus, and what those threats, what was the implication of those threats? What were the results? A blue screen, a slow performance on your network environment. You had to reboot, maybe clean it up. It was an inconvenience is what it was at the time. And, then we kind of, move over the intervening 10 years or so. Well, what happened was the threats were weaponized to a large degree. You had distributed denial of services attacks that would actually, flood information networks and bring them down, make them unavailable simply because there was way too much information that they could try to process. Remote access exploits, that was a big one that nailed, Target, Dairy Queen, Home Depot, those are just a smattering of a number of organizations with, again, really significant IT budgets and certainly made heavy investments in security. Again, those investments were typically around technology, but significant investments all the same. They were exposed due to third parties, HVAC vendors or otherwise had access to those network environments. Those third parties were compromised. And those third parties, the perpetrators could then leverage that infrastructure to get into, really those big corporate environments. So that was one, 0-day vulnerability exploits. When vulnerabilities are introduced into the wild, there's a period, there's a lapse in time where the manufacturer needs to put out a patch, right, to make sure that vulnerability is secured. During that lag time, there's an opportunity for perpetrators to go out there. So let me find where those new vulnerabilities exist. Let me try to exploit those. And right now, it seems to be, ransomware is kind of the order of the day. It seems to be running rampant anyway, with your network's data being held hostage in exchange for a ransom demand. And that they've been very successful, and these business models really have turned into very lucrative opportunities for cybercrime. And cybercrime has really evolved to not only nation states, but really sophisticated enterprises where you can actually purchase exploit kits, right? You can go on the dark web, purchase an exploit kit, and essentially it's plug and play. It's very easy to roll out for very, individuals with just a cursory understanding on what they're doing. So it makes the threat that much larger. So now we've kind of moved on here to, again, with all these happenings, there was a recognition that, okay, we need to up our game. We were far too myopic with our definition for, information security. Again, these breaches were still happening on a regular basis in increasing frequency. Again, why are we only looking at our critical assets? And again, what they've done, they being, the industry at large and regulatory agencies in particular, have emphasized this concept of resiliency. And I want to, focus on that word, because what that word suggests is that if you have the appropriate protocols and infrastructure and, I guess, program in place relative to cybersecurity, you're going to be positioned such that if there is a security incident, it stays exactly that. I use that term purposely. And when I say incident, you'll notice I didn't say breach, I didn't say compromise. And you kind of get into semantics here. Legalese, okay, well, what constitutes a breach or a compromise? Typically it's if any data has been exfiltrated from your environment, right? If it's left your environment, I think that rises to that level of standard. If any data within your environment has been modified to any degree, again, I think that rises to that standard as well. However, if you're able to identify, again, the incident at its earliest stage and go through, like I said, isolation, containment, reporting protocols, you are able to essentially isolate that particular incident, continue, again, your operations as you would otherwise, but you're minimizing the impact that incident is having and preventing that incident from becoming a breach or a compromise. And how do you do that? Well, what you see in front of you here, this on the right-hand side, this graphic is taken from the NIST, the National Institute for Security Technology, Standards and Technologies, rather. There are 5 particular security domains: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And within those 5 domains, there's a number of sub-control categories, right, that wrap up in, access control and, authentication and backup, and, there's a number of them. I mean, within the NIST cybersecurity framework, I think there's 104, 109, somewhere in that range, control objectives. And there's a number of security frameworks out there. The FFIEC, again, for the financial institutions, they have their own framework, cybersecurity framework. And, there's, I think, 494 control objectives. And again, now you're kind of right-sizing it for financial institutions, again, part of our critical infrastructure nationwide. So, perhaps those 494 controls are adequate for an organization that, has that sort of responsibility on its shoulders. But the NIST has defined their framework for consisting of 104, 109, like I said, control objectives that are really associated with these security domains. And, it allows an organization to really broaden out the definition on, okay, we're building a program here. And in order to do that, it's not just technology, it's about having an understanding and awareness level organizationally. And it's also about, making sure that we can pursue our goals and objectives in a manner that's consistent with the risk that we're taking on as an organization. So again, looking outside the box, outside of your organization, what do we need to account for? Well, we need to make sure we have a forensics firm at the ready, right? So if you have, you're going through an incident of some kind, you need to investigate at a forensic level. Have you already established relationships with a third party? So you're not, in the heat of the moment, you're running around with your hair on fire, trying to source out who you might want to work with and what the particulars are around contractual arrangements and commitments. Get that stuff out of the way in advance, right? Have that forensic firm at ready. Legal counsel, right? Do you have access to a legal mind anyway that can speak to the particulars around the legalese relative to any particular cybersecurity incident? Insurance contingencies. If you have a liability policy, a cyber liability policy, oftentimes there are requirements. In order to make an eligible claim, you oftentimes have to do X, Y, and Z in advance. Make sure you know what those things are. You're going to want to draw on that policy. It's there for a reason, but make sure you know what your responsibilities are, again, to be eligible to make an effective claim there. Law enforcement. Again, do you have dialogue established with the appropriate agencies? Have those discussions already been handled, or do you at least have a communication line established with those groups? Public relations, right? Who can speak on behalf of the organization? What information can they disclose? More importantly, what information should they not disclose, right? Think about these things in advance, right? Prepare for the likelihood that this will come down the line at some point or another, and make sure that these things are accounted for. So here we have our friend here where, again, we are trying to change the narrative around cybersecurity, which we talked about it. It's typically thought as cumbersome. It's not a natural aspect of the organization. Typically looked at as an afterthought, typically causes apprehension and discomfort, again, because it's imposed on you. It's something we have to do. It's a necessary evil, right? And kind of resembles this guy that you're looking on the screen here. So how do we change that dynamic as an organization? Well, let's move from, move to kind of this baked in model. Let's operationalize cybersecurity. Let's make it part of how we do business. It's a natural aspect of our organization because it's integrated with the organization's mission. It's understood that there are benefits that are to be recognized as a result of this programmatic approach. It's an aspect of our core strategy and mission. It's not someone else's role, right? We're all in it together. This is, again, an organizational responsibility. It's delicious, that is subjective, but hopefully it more resembles something of a nice, baked apple pie. It's not Frankenstein. It's something a little bit more palatable, let's call it. All right, so it's all easy. It's all well and good to suggest, well, that's kind of the approach we should take or the direction we should head in. How do we do it? That's really where the rubber meets the road. And that's where we're talking about developing this culture of cybersecurity. So, people are the ones that conceive, design, configure, and use all the tools of business, and create the information. And without people, there's nothing to protect, right? So from a people aspect, let's start with people. Again, people, process, technology, like we talked about earlier. Leadership, governance, oversight. The tone has to be set from the top, right? Actions speak louder than words. So, it requires accountability of self and workforce. What does it say if, leadership and executives aren't following the same rules that they are trying to get everyone else to adhere to? What message does that send? Again, participation by example, investment in the protection of information, people, and the mission. It's more than words, right? So that's a critical aspect. And, really, from a leadership and executive perspective, again, I think people perceive cybersecurity, again, because they see it primarily as a technology problem. They see it as overwhelming, and they want to kind of keep it at arm's length. They find it intimidating oftentimes, simply because they might not be as technically adept as they feel they should be. Again, but that's just a misconception, and it's important to overcome that in order to overcome that hurdle. So look at your hiring process. Do your job descriptions include cybersecurity responsibilities for each role type? If they don't, consider including them in the job description, right? Then you can actually evaluate performance based on adhering to certain requirements relative to that job description. Are background checks performed prior to hire? Periodic rechecks for critical or sensitive information. Training, right? IT training for everyone. Demystify the machines. People think their experience whenever they're logged on doing their daily tasks through their laptop or computer PC, whatever they're doing, they think it's a very personal experience. In reality, what's happening behind the scenes and the thousands of communications that are literally happening on a continuous basis, that is eye-opening once you understand the amount of information that you are responsible for. Those data points that are being sent as a result of your activity, again, it's just lost on a lot of people, right? So kind of give them an awareness there. Consider, rather than just an instructor, consider an instructor-led approach to awareness training. Right, rather than it being simply, sort of user acceptance or computer-based training, right, where you're going through and clicking through a 10-question quiz, whatever it might be. That is kind of by the book, if you will, just to satisfy a compliance need. Consider a instructor-led approach. Have someone share their experience with them, with the, end users, with functional management, with leadership and executives. Again, it's much more effective, and bulletins and notices, periodic reminders. That I think what's if something is put on a wall, a public display there, a public service announcement, whatever it might happen to be in an organization, I think it's 3 days. By which that messaging goes right into the subconscious, doesn't even reflect on anyone's radar after the fact. So change it up. And that will, kind of get people to tune in and take notice anyway. Included in performance reviews. So each individual's results of testing activity, if you're doing any sort of social engineering, we'll get into that in a minute, but, make it part of the performance review. Tie it to the money. I mean, if you really wanted to make an impact and people you have, repeat offenders, let's say, that are not following protocols, not going through the appropriate authentication or authorization steps before they take action or disclose information. If there's some penalty involved there, typically that's going to change behavior, because that's what we're talking about here is changing behavior. Right. And when we talk about changing behavior, again, the financial institutions, they were mandated, they were legislated, their behavior had to change because it was forced upon them. For organizations that aren't there yet, this has to be a selective sort of approach to change behavior. But, how do you do it in the absence of legislation? Well, here are some considerations by changing your culture, right? Cultures change automatically when it's legislated, but if, absent of that, what tools do you have at your disposal? These are some of them. Process culture, right? So here's another important area of consideration where every process, should include learning and improvement. Every process should be comprised of accountability touch points and provide end-to-end corroboration of the function it represents. This is oftentimes an area of little consideration, or I guess a big area of need relative to, again, building up a program. So what are we talking about for process culture? Look at things like user and equipment provisioning. So you have, how are we doing on time? About 10 minutes, okay. User equipment, so centrally managed, typically the IT function is the group that is looking to provision equipment. Distributed performance, right? So does everyone get a business asset that's automatically loaded with the same tools and functions, applications, privileges, et cetera? If that's the case, then, there is a level of risk involved there. How do you mitigate that risk? Well, go to each of the functional managers and get an understanding for what role type are you hiring for? What information do they need? What sort of privileges do they need? Try again to restrain or reduce the likelihood that someone has access to information that they wouldn't otherwise need, right? Because if that account gets compromised, well, someone looking to do bad things all of a sudden has keys to take out or at least address whatever that happens to be. Right? Appropriate system access is granted by approval, right? So again, when it comes to process, you define the process, make sure you have exceptions, because there's going to be exceptions without a doubt, but make sure that exception is justified or at least documented, right? And then you can make sure that, okay, we have a documented process for granting this exception, and it's been accepted, right, by the business approvers, the business management, that this isn't something that's we just made out of pocket here. I mean, it's something that was kind of taken into recognition, reviewed, and it went through that review process. Change management, again, a huge area of need. Change types based on risk, right? So if you're making any network change, right, you're introducing a new supporting technology. Well, what are the considerations? Is it hosted? Is it on site? Who has access to it? What is the risk associated with that change? And what should we be doing to account for that risk? Do we even have a process for calculating and quantifying that risk? Procedural and documentation rigor based on those change types, changes performed compared to approved changes, change advisory boards, all of these things are critical in terms of process culture. Cyber risk management. Does your organization have an appetite statement around risk, right? What is the risk appetite for the organization? It's unique to every organization. Have those conversations been had? Those conversations are difficult, and oftentimes you don't know where to begin. Consider introducing or bringing on a third party, an expert, a domain expert to help that conversation get started. Do you have a standardized methodology for quantifying risk? Do you understand vulnerabilities, threats, impact, likelihood? You're trying to drive at these repeatable results. Programmatic remediation of elevated and severe risks. So you have some process in place by which, once you've identified what the risk is, now what do we do with it? It's all well and good, we've identified it. Let's do something about it, right? Account review, centralized management, distributed performance, right? Are there stale accounts that are part of your AD environment? Get them out of there. What are they there for? They represent risk. Those are a critical process on a periodic basis. What sort of frequency do you have established for uncovering what those things are? Activity review, behavioral analysis, right? Look for anomalies, right? You're trying to baseline normalcy in your environment for what is quote unquote normal, recognizing there's going to be fluctuations there. But when there's something out of the ordinary, take a look at it. Can it be justified, easily explained, or is there something else going on that you might want to account for? Very important. Threat intelligence, right? So do you have an understanding on, what is happening from a threat perspective, the external threat landscape? Is that information easily accessible? How is it disseminated across the organization, right? Are people getting that information, and is it meaningful to them based on their role type? Critical information that is not easy to not easy, I guess, to do on your own. Oftentimes, these are competencies that need to be built up over time. This isn't an overnight sort of proposition here. However, if you work your way, again, by advancing the maturity of your program, you'll get to a point where, okay, you're developing these things such that they become part of your business. System lifecycle management. I know we're getting toward time here. Third is technology culture. Again, this is typically where the majority of time and energy has been spent. Firewalls, IDS, IPS, zero-day protection. This is relative to your network perimeter. Multi-factor authentication, multi-layer authentication, things of that nature. Defense in depth, again, looking not only from the outside of your network, but also looking on the inside. So internal network controls. IDS, IPS, again, data leakage prevention, right? Making sure that you have keyword identifiers to prevent certain information from leaving your environment, web and internet filtering, antivirus. Practice. Testing is not practiced, it is testing. So practice gives us all an opportunity to make mistakes. That's how we learn, right? So we have certain plans in place, an incident response plan. Exercise that plan, go through practice sessions, right? How can we improve upon the unknowns? Because inevitably there's going to be unknowns. And finally, testing around people, social engineering, right? So you can do network or customer telephone calls, you can do phishing engagements to test your people. Process-wise, you can audit your change management process. You can audit your HR processes, right? Make sure that these things are going through as intended. If there are outliers, again, is it a one-off? Is it a systemic problem? How do you account for that? Technology. You can test your network environments. You can go through exercises like penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, configuration assessments, disaster recovery, a number of things there. And finally, what you're looking at here, again, we talked about this life cycle approach, just to kind of orient you to what you're looking at here, this graph on the right-hand side of the page, this graphic rather, cybersecurity maturity tiers, right? So you have this tier 1 foundational all the way to tier 5 sustainable. This inner band here are really the functional disciplines, the subject matters that are catered to. Everything from governance, strategy, and guidance to testing and assessment to monitoring and detection. And again, then within this inner band, these pieces of the pie here, these are more tactical or granular aspects on this life cycle: policies, procedures, plans, education and training, risk and compliance management, pen testing, vulnerability assessment, social engineering, so on and so forth. Again, I can't emphasize enough that this is really where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And if you're doing any one of these things, you're better off than you would otherwise. But it's really where the combination of these things are really where the most value comes. So I know I'm right up against it. So I will transition over to Paula for any questions. Appreciate your time, everyone. But Paula, over to you.
Okay. So we did drink from a fire hose as promised. Thank you, Brendan, for that. I don't have anything in the chat, but if anybody has a question, please ask it. I think maybe you said it towards the end is, this is a lot of information. It's a lot to pay attention to. So if you had to pick, where would you start? What were the 1 or 2 things that really make critical sense if you are going to think about and protect your organization and your documents from cybersecurity hacks? And so where would you start? What are those 2 or 3 key things?
It's a great question, Paula. And that, quite honestly, that's a question, I get on a regular basis. People know that there's a need here. We need to get our hands around it. How do we go about doing it? The first step is really understanding your risk. And conducting a comprehensive risk analysis on your organization that covers those 3 areas, people, process, technology, will allow you to identify your biggest areas of need. Because you have a limited budget, you have limited resources, so you can only take on a limited amount of what you already know is quite a challenge, right? So how do you distill that down to say, where am I going to get the best bang for my buck, the best return on investment? In order to do that, quite honestly, a risk assessment is the perfect starting point.
Perfect. Matt, I'm going to turn it back over to you so you can wrap up the session. Thank you, Brendan, for answering the questions. And I'm sure that as people review the PDF and the PowerPoint, they might start getting a plan together. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Thank you for attending this morning's session. The next session on municipal bond issuance with Columbia Capital starts at 10:15. Thank you, everyone.